I've had multiple careers in my life. I used to design mobile computers, but for the last 20 years, in fact, for my whole life's ambition was to study neuroscience, and I've been doing that for 40 years on and off, but full-time for the last 20 years. First at running a neuroscience institute, which is at Berkeley, and now in independent research labs. This conference is about beliefs and false beliefs, and I'm going to talk about the deep science underlying how brains form beliefs and false beliefs. This is going to be a neuroscience lecture. It's going to cover a lot of ground. I'm just giving you a little heads up about that. Okay, so let's just get into it. Just real quickly, my company is very unusual. We're in Northern California. We do basic research in neuroscience. We study how the neocortex works. We publish papers. We go to conferences. We organize scientific meetings and so on. We do this typical thing you typically do. We have a second mission, which is applied research. This is in artificial intelligence, and we're specifically interested in how we take things we've learned about the brain, apply it to today's existing AI, and how we can build truly intelligent machines, which I believe you can only do if you understand how the brain works first. Today, I'm just going to talk about the neuroscience, about the neocortex. So let's just get into it. If you look at a brain, this is obviously a line drawing a brain, you can roughly divide it into two parts. You can consider the old brain, which is a set of different organs in the bottom of this picture here. It's about 30% of the volume of your brain. There are dozens of specialized regions. Most of them you can't see in this picture because they're up in the center of the brain. Then there's the neocortex, which literally means new outer layer or new bark. It's about 75% of your brain, of a human brain. Only mammals have a neocortex, and humans it's become very large. If I could take it out of your head and iron it flat, it would be pretty much like this dinner napkin. It's about this big. It's about 1,500 square centimeters. It's about 2 to 3 millimeters thick. This is a good model of 70% of your brain. There's an interest, you can say, so what do these different things do? Well, the old brain, you can think of this as all the basic functions of life. It controls breathing, digestion, reflex behaviors. When you walk and run, it's typically the old brain doing that. Chewing, all of your emotions are generated in the old brain. The neocortex is responsible, what you might think of as conscious perception. When you look at me here on the stage and you're aware that you're seeing me, that's going on in the neocortex. My language is being generated by the neocortex. Your neocortex is interpreting it, hopefully. All things we think about intelligence, everything that humans have ever done of interest, of intelligence, is the creation of the neocortex. It's that dinner napkin is pretty much humanity. There's an interesting relationship between the neocortex and the old brain. There's around 20 billion neurons in the neocortex, but none of them actually connect to muscles. The neocortex cannot make a single muscle move. Instead, the projections from the neocortex go to various parts of the old brain and try to get the old brain to do what it wants to do. A very simple example is breathing. Breathing is a part of the old brain. You don't think about breathing most of the time. You can breathe while you're sleeping. It just happens. But the neocortex projects to the old parts of the brain that control breathing. It can say, you know what, right now I'd like you to stop, or right now I'd like you to take a deep breath, something like that. But what happens is the old brain is always in control. So if the neocortex says, stop breathing, and it says, fine. After a little while, it says, we're running out of oxygen. I don't give a damn what you want. We're going to breathe again. All you can see is perhaps at lunch, you'll see a piece of chocolate cake. And the neocortex says, I shouldn't eat it. It's high calories. I'm trying to lose weight. It's full of fats. It's going to clog my heart. It's going to kill me. But the old brain says, smells good, looks good. We're going to eat it. That's really what's going on. This relationship actually explains a lot about human behaviors and the problems we have in the world, and I'll get back to it in a moment. So the question is, what does the neocortex do? You might think of it as like a computer, like it gets these inputs, and it processes and it does something, but that's not what it does. You're sitting here right now, you're hearing my words, and you're not doing much, but you're doing something very intelligent. Many neuroscientists, and myself included, have figured out that right way to thinking about this is that the neocortex builds or learns a model of the world. That's its goal, is to learn a model of the world. That model contains everything you know. It's not a list of facts in your head, it's a model. It's literally a model of the world, and it includes how things look and feel and sound. I brought a few props with me. I'm going to use this coffee cup quite a bit. I have a model of what this coffee cup feels like and what it looks like and what it sounds like when I put it on surfaces and how it transfers heat and so on. I have this all learned. It's in my head, but it's a model of the coffee cup. It also stores how things change, interact over time. So we all have a model. If you have a cell phone like this, we all have a model of it. And as I touch the buttons, I have expectations what's going to happen, how they're going to move, what's going to show on the screen. And when I touch those icons on the screen, it's going to change. I have to have a model of that. We've all stored this in how apps work and so on. The model in your cortex also includes where things are. There could be temporary things, like where's the wallet? It's in my back pocket right now. It could be permanent things, like where's the library in your town, or where's the bathroom in your house, or where are the nail clippers in the bathroom. These things are stored in your neocortex, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. The model includes sort of abstract concepts, such as words and concepts. What's democracy, and so on. So this is all stored in this brain's model. Now, why does the brain need a model? A model allows you to plan and act on the world. It allows you to say, well, first of all, it says, what's going to happen if I do X? If I move this direction, what will I see? If I move my finger here, or if I turn my head, what will I see? It predicts the outcomes of your behaviors, but most importantly, it allows you to plan. And we'll talk about this more in a middle bit, but models are kind of like a map of a town. They allow you to understand the structure of the world, and they allow you to act upon that structure. You can look at that model and say, what should I do? Now, in the brain, the models are what we call predictive. And what we know is that every moment of your waking life, your neocortex is predicting what inputs are going to happen next. You're not aware of most of these predictions. They're silent. You're just not aware of them. But every time you touch something, or you move your finger over a surface, or you move your eyes, your brain is predicting what it's going to see or feel or hear. It's a very detailed prediction. You're not aware of it. You can know for certain that it's happening, because if anything changes, your attention is drawn to it. If I move my hand over this lectern, I have an expectation what I'm going to feel. If all of a sudden, did that move? Did you lose my sound? Okay. If something felt different than it normal does, your attention would be drawn to it. Can you still hear me okay? Okay, because it's hanging on a thread on my ear there. Now, prediction is how the brain tests its model. It's constantly saying, is my model correct? Is my model correct? And if there's a violation of the prediction, then it modifies its model. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, we can think about this, the neocortex. It's the brain's model, the model in neocortex is our belief system. And it's how we structure our beliefs about the world, and it can be wrong. It can get it wrong. I'm going to talk about that. So the next question is, how does the neocortex learn to model the world? We're going to dive into some more neuroscience here about this. So if you look at the neocortex, it looks uniform. You do not see any demarcations. It's just like that dinner napkin, but we know it's divided into functional regions, dozens of them. And so there are regions associated that get input from the skin, the somatic regions that get input from the ears, regions that get input from the visual regions, that's in the back of your head. There are regions that are dedicated to language, those are on your left temporal lobe. And there's many other regions throughout the neocortex that are very difficult to characterize exactly what they're doing. We know these regions exist because the connections between them, the white matter in the brain connects different areas of the neocortex to each other, and it creates a sort of connected map, if you will. Now, these things don't look different on the surface. And so you might think, well, but vision seems different than audition, it seems different than touch, which seems different than language. So maybe if I look at the detailed circuitry under those regions, we would see that they're quite different. But that's not what we found. Going back 120 years ago, we first started to be able to look at the details of the neocortex. These pictures are from famous scientist Ramón y Cajal, Santiago Cajal, and these were 120 years ago. He was the first guy to say, look, these are pictures showing across the 2.5 millimeters of the cortex, and you see those little dots are neurons. There's actually far more than are shown in this picture, and the connections between them. And so they started building out the circuitry and learning the details of what the neocortex looks like. But the amazing thing about it is it looks pretty much the same everywhere. Everywhere. The language areas look like, the vision areas look like. If you look at a mouse's neocortex, it looks like a human's, and a dog's and a cat's. They're all looking very similar. There are differences. And so if you look at one region on a human and another region on a human, you can find differences, but the differences are minor. So after 120 years, there have literally been thousands of papers published on the details of how the neocortex is structured. These are anatomy, physiology, gene expression, biochemistry, and so on. And I cannot possibly even begin to summarize the complexity of the circuitry involved here, but I'm just going to give you some flavors of it, and I'm going to talk about some of it. Here's a picture that I use in some of our papers. We're talking about there's different types of cells. There's dozens of different types of cells. They're arranged in this sort of quasi-laminar structure, and there's these very complex connections between them. These arrows I show here represent the projections of tens of thousands of neurons between one layer and another layer. But they're prototypical. Again, it looks the same everywhere, which is a mystery. How could this be? How could language and vision be the same thing? So the question is, how is it possible that the neocortex looks the same everywhere? The first person to propose an answer to this was a brilliant man named Vernon Mountcastle, a neurophysiologist, and he published a monograph in 1978, which he made the following arguments. He says, the reason the neocortex looks the same everywhere is because every region is doing the same thing. They all have the same intrinsic function. And why one region is vision and another region is audition is because what it's connected to. So he's literally saying, if you can take a sheet of neocortex and you connect it to an eye, you get vision. If you can connect it to an ear, you get hearing. If you connect it to the skin, you get touch. And if you connect the outputs of some regions to other regions, you get things like language. That was a hard thing to believe, but it's true, and there's lots and lots of empirical evidence to support this. They've actually done that experiment where they rerouted the optical nerve of a ferret into the auditory region. Long time ago. So the next thing he proposed in this thing, he said, the reason, the human neocortex got large very recently, very big. Humans haven't been around that long in our current form. And how did the neocortex get so large? He said the neocortex got large by replicating the same function. There's a single function, he called it a cortical column, and evolution discovered you can make lots of them. And that's how our neocortex got big so rapidly. So he said the cortical column, which he proposes about 1 millimeter in dimension, is the functional unit of the neocortex. You and I would have, at that dimension, we'd have about 150,000 of these in our neocortex. Now, I show a picture here, it's a cartoon drawing. If you actually look at the neocortex, you would not see columns. They're not visible. In a few places, in a few species there are, in the rat somatosensory cortex, for example. But mostly they're not. But the physiologists can determine that they're there. I won't go into how they know that, but it's established fact in some sense that these columns are there. And even though some people still think that this is controversial, because they just can't believe it's true, that that we are basically, everything we do is 150,000 copies of the same circuit. But that's an amazing discovery. I think it's right up there with Darwin's discovery of evolution. This is, how everything we think about intelligence is based on a single algorithm. So our thing was, we spent decades trying to figure out what this column does. And 3.5 years ago, we made lots of progress over the years, but 3.5 years ago, we had a poignant discovery, and I'm going to share it with you right now. I was sitting at my desk. I was holding a coffee cup that looked just like this one. It might have been actually this one. Did I hit the wrong button there? I didn't want to do that. I did hit the wrong button. Oh, gosh. I'm sorry. Now I'm supposed to hit the bottom left button again? There we go. Okay. How do I start it? Any suggestions on how I get it going again? Use my brain? All right. Well, I'm going to go forward while someone comes up here and helps me with my klutziness. I'm going to go forward with the thought experiment. All right, just pay no attention to this man. He's not here. So I was holding this coffee cup in my hand. I was actually waiting for my wife to come to join me for lunch. And I was moving my finger over the cup. And I was saying to myself, of course, I knew this already, that the brain predicts what I'm going to feel when I touch this cup. So my finger's on the side of the cup, and I'm about to move it to the top rim. I can anticipate what I'm going to feel. I don't have to look at it. I just know what I'm going to feel. I'm going to feel this curvy, rounded lip up here. And if I move it to this side, I'm going to feel the handle. And if I move it to the bottom, I'm going to feel this unglazed area down here. And so I said, well, what does it take for the neocortex to make that prediction, that very simple prediction? Well, it needs to know two things. It needs to know what object it's touching, a coffee cup, because different objects would have different sensations. And it needs to know where the finger is on the cup, relative to the cup. Now, it doesn't matter where the cup is relative to my body. It doesn't matter if it's oriented different ways. What matters is where my finger is relative to the cup. And to make that prediction, the neocortex needs to know the location of my finger on the cup and where it will be after it moves, in anticipation. Now, if I grab the cup with my entire hand, every part of my skin is making predictions about what it's going to feel. And again, we know that because if anything felt different, you would notice it. So we already knew that part. And that tells me that the neocortex is tracking the location of every single part of my skin in a reference frame relative to the cup. And this was the key insight, that the neurons in your neocortex establish a reference frame. You can think of a reference frame like the XYZ coordinates that we all learned in high school. But establishes a reference frame and on the cup that travels with the cup. This is hard to imagine that neurons could do this, but that's what that thought experiment said. Okay, This led to what we now call the Thousand Brains theory of intelligence. I'm going to just tell you some highlights of it. The first thing is that every cortical column is capable of learning complete models of something. Complete models, I say objects in quote, because we talk about physical objects, but there can be other things it can learn as well. And the basic idea how it does this, there's two inputs to the column. There's the and we're just going to stick with the finger on the coffee cup for now. There's the input from the fingertip. That goes into one layer of cells in the cortex. This is well established. And I call that the sense feature, if you will. But there's another layer of cells that's representing the reference frame that's being assigned to this cup. And it's that represents the location on the cup. The other input coming into the cortex is a movement command. It's basically saying, how is the finger moving? And so that, when the cortex gets a movement command from the old brain or elsewhere, it says, oh, I need to update the location of where this finger is going to be in this reference frame. The blue arrow, it's shown there, is a way of learning the structure of the cup. It's a way of assigning different sense features at different locations in the reference frame of the cup. So as you move your finger over the cup, it basically assigns the different sensations to different locations, and this is in some sense like a CAD model of what the cup looks like and what it feels like. We've also shown there's another layer there representing the object, which in this case is the cup. Now, a couple things I want to say about this. The key thing here is that columns create this reference frame, and they create unique reference frames for every object, and every column in your cortex does this. By the way, if you know anything about neuroscience, you might have heard of grid cells and place cells. These are important discoveries made about 20 years ago that people won Nobel Prizes for. We believe the same mechanism used by grid cells and place cells are being used in the cortex. So just a little aside for those who are in the know about that. A reference frame, again, is like a map. I've already talked about it. That's the way to think about it. In the cup example, it's a three-dimensional map, but you can think of it as an analogy like a paper map. And the paper map is a model of a town, for example, or a model of whatever it represents. So say it's a town, and it allows you to assign things relative to locations to each other, and it allows you to make predictions of what's going to happen. If I'm at this point in the town, if I go this direction, what am I going to see? If I go that direction, what am I going to see? And it allows you to plan. It says, well, I'm at the library right now, and I want to get to the coffee shop. How should I do that? And you can look at the map, this reference frame, and say, oh, there's different ways of getting there. That's what basically is going on in every cortical column. And we have shown through both mathematical analysis and through detailed simulation, I won't get into the details, these are quite complex, that a single column can learn hundreds of complex objects, or hundreds of maps, if you will, populated maps. That's not everything you know, but it's a lot. So a single column can't learn everything, but it can learn hundreds of things. The next thing to say is, well, of course, we have many columns in your brain. Remember, there's 150,000 in your neocortex. And so what we believe is going on, that for every object in the world, there are thousands of complementary models. Let's just talk about three columns. In this case, imagine I'm touching the coffee cup with 3 fingers. Each one is going to be input to the tip of those fingers to 3 different columns in your somatosensory cortex. Each one of those columns is going to establish a reference frame or a model for the coffee cup. And each one has a unique location. The 3 fingertips are somewhat independently moving, so they have to have their own locations and their own sense features. But notice that they all are touching the same object. They're all touching the coffee cup. And what you find in the cortex, there are some layers of cells, just 2 of them actually, they have these long-range projections that go across the entire surface of the cortex, throughout long distances in the neocortex. And what we believe they're doing is they're voting. They're basically saying, there's 3 fingers in this case saying, we're all touching something, we may not be certain what it is, but we can all agree, what is the thing that's consistent between all of us, and we can say, it's got to be a coffee cup. And this is why if I ask you to reach your hand into a black box and touch something with 1 finger and ask you what it is, you would almost certainly have to move your finger over the surface and say, oh, now I see what it is. But if you reach in and you grab it with your hand all at once, you don't have to move. And you go, oh, I get it. That's because these columns, each one does not have complete knowledge of it, but they have partial knowledge, and they vote and say, what's the only thing that makes sense for us to do this? The same thing is going on in vision. You may think vision is taking a picture. It is not. Neuroscientists have known this for a long time, but it's still a misconception. There's nothing looking at the image coming from your retina. The retina is an array of sensors, just like your skin is an array of sensors. And they just happen to move together, but they're still just an array of sensors. And they project columns that only look at a small part. Each patch of the retina is like a patch of the skin. And the same thing is going on in there. The visual cortex, we believe, and we've published this in papers, the visual cortex a column in the visual cortex is tracking the location of its input on the object being viewed. It's sort of like, if you think about vision, the equivalent of a single finger in vision would be like looking through a straw. And if you look through a straw, you can only see a little bit of thing at once. It's one column getting input, and to recognize something, you have to move it around, just like you have to move your finger. But if you see the whole thing at once, it's like a whole bunch of fingers touching at the same time, and you say, I know what that thing is. Okay. There's an interesting consequence of this. And that interesting consequences are, it solves what's called the binding problem or the sensor fusion problem. You might have heard of that. There's a question if we have all these inputs coming into the brain, but we have this singular perception. And you're looking at me here on the stage, and right at the moment, all of your eyes are moving about 3 times a second. You're not aware of it, but they are. And the input to your cortex is changing rapidly, 3 times a second. But I seem stable. Nothing looks like it's moving around up here. And this has been a sort of a mystery for a long time. This explains it, because what's going on is the inputs are changing in these columns. All of them are getting different locations and different inputs, but the voting layer is stable, and that is what you perceive. So it solves that problem. It's very interesting. Now I want to turn to high-level concepts. This has not been my focus, and we have not published papers on this, but I'm going to share some thoughts about this. I'm going to make the argument that everything we know, all knowledge, is based on reference frames. And once you understand that, you can understand how we form beliefs and false beliefs. So I'll give you an example. If someone asks you to memorize a long list of items, it's very difficult to do. But there's a memory trick called the Method of Loci you might have heard about, where you take that list of items and you mentally assign each item to a place in your home. So you go in the front door, and the lobby says, okay, the first item goes there, and then you go in the stairwell, the next item's there, the top of the stair, the next item's there, the bathroom's over here. And when you do this, it becomes much, much easier to memorize this list, because when someone asks you to recall the list, what you literally do is just mentally walk through your house, and you'll see those items. This tells us that the brain wants to store knowledge in a reference frame. If there wasn't an obvious reference frame, it's going to borrow another one. A house is not a good reference frame for a random list of facts, but it's better than none. And so that makes it much, much easier for you to retrieve that knowledge. So I'm just going to, the question now is how does the neocortex create language and mathematics and other forms of abstract thought? We don't know the answer to this question, but I can say a few things about it. First of all, the anatomical evidence strongly suggests that the same mechanism that we use to recognize coffee cups and cell phones and other simple physical things is being used to represent these concepts and abstract thoughts. The neuroanatomy looks the same everywhere. And by the way, now there's empirical evidence that shows that there's evidence of these reference frames in higher level cortical areas. So we have empirical evidence for this now as well. So we don't understand all of this, but I'll walk through a few items here. One thing you should know is, first of all, the inputs to these columns is not a sensory input. It's coming from other columns. So it's the inputs to these columns are modeling some aspect of the world, but they're basing it on the inferred output of other columns. So now we sort of introduced a chain which can possibly lead to errors. New objects, I put in quotes, are composition of other objects. And this is true in physical things like a coffee cup. My coffee cup has a logo on it, the Numenta logo. But imagine if that logo had a coffee cup on it. Then I would have, and that logo on that coffee cup had another Numenta logo and so on. That would be a recursive structure. These columns can do that. And recursive structure is very a necessary component of basically all high-level thought and language. And so it allows us to build up more complex structures built on previous complex structures. And thinking, then, is a form of movement. When the movement input to a high-level column isn't actual physical movement. I don't have to think about mathematics or think about democracy. I don't have to move my limbs. But there's still the concept of moving, just in the same way as you mentally move through your house. You're mentally moving through basically a reference frame where some concept you're thinking about has various items stored within that reference frame. And so that's how you recall. When you think, you go from item to item to item. It's not random. It's basically on depending on what adjacencies you have in the reference frame of the knowledge you've stored. Now, I want to just give you a simple example here how this can go. Interesting things can happen here. I'm going to say that the same inputs can be arranged differently in different reference frames. Imagine I was going to give you 10 facts of history. And one teacher says, okay, class, we're going to put that on a timeline. That's a reference frame. It's a way of organizing the data in a way that it gives us some structure. And you can infer from that, say, oh, this must have happened before that. And if I wanted to get to here, there's a big gap. And maybe these things coincided because they had a causal relationship with one another. Another teacher may take the exact same facts and put them on a map of the world. It's a different map, different reference frame. And that's a valid reference frame too. And now you would end up with different, you could say, you would end up with sort of different beliefs about those facts and different types of inferences you can make from them. You might say, these occurred close together spatially on the map, so maybe they're causally related because of that. Or maybe there's a mountain range between them, that explains that, and so on. The point is, when you get to higher level thoughts, it's not obvious what kind of reference frame you should assign facts to. It's maybe obvious when you touch a coffee cup, but it's not so obvious above. And this is a large part of what we call learning is figuring out how to assign data or facts to reference frames. I'm pretty certain this was going on. Now, just to close up here quickly, if we think about the neocortex, and we've studied these sort of primary sensory regions mostly, they get direct sensory input. They get them from the skin, the ears, and the eyes. They learn models of physical things that can be sensed directly, physical properties of the world, models such as cell phones and coffee cups. And these models are constantly verified by direct sensory input. So if I had an incorrect model of the coffee cup, and I said, I thought this coffee cup was round, but it actually had a flat surface on it, and am I moving my fingers around it, I'd feel that and go, that's not right. And I look at it, and I would change my model of the coffee cup to more accurately reflect what it is. Now, most of the columns in the neocortex, the vast majority of them, do not get direct sensory input. They only get input from other columns. And they learn models of other things. They learn models of language and abstract thought and concepts. But these models cannot be verified by direct sensory input. You have no way of doing that. It's kind of dependent on the chain below it to get you there. And you can think about this leads to various ways we can form false beliefs. I'm just going to list 3 that occurred to me while I was putting together this talk. One way is if we don't have all the facts, if we don't have all the data. In a coffee cup, if I've never touched the bottom of the coffee cup, I might assume it's flat, and I miss that data, and my model may be incorrect. Maybe there's a hole there, and if I didn't have that data, but if I have the data, I'll correct it. Any other kind of belief is that way too. If we omit facts that are contrary to the model, we don't have them, or someone doesn't give them to you, you won't know about it. And so your model cannot accommodate it. You can also introduce false facts. I could tell you something that says, you know what, this thing is made of cheese, and it's not really made of cheese, or something like that. But if you don't really know any better, you're going to try to accommodate that into your model. You're going to try to arrange that fact into a reference frame. And finally, there are different reference frames. You can take the exact same data and rearrange them in different reference frames and come up with completely different beliefs. These are all ways this can go wrong. Now, I want to emphasize that, let me summarize, and then I'll emphasize in a moment here. The point of my talk here is that the neocortex learns a model of the world. That model of the world is our reality, is what we believe. We do not actually perceive the world as it is, we perceive our model. And if that model is correct, it's great. If it's incorrect, we'll have incorrect expectations about it. But that model is what we know and what we believe. We are beginning to understand, and I'm going to emphasize beginning to understand, exactly how this model works. I didn't talk about the details of the neurons, but we go down into real low-level details on these models to understand how the actual neurons learn the structure of the world and how is it structured in this sort of distributed model. We're beginning to understand that in detail. So it's built on reference frames in every cortical column. Now, there's a lot more data about this. If you want, you just go to our website, a link to all the papers. I didn't talk about them here. There's all kinds of materials if you're interested in following up on this. I'm in the process of writing a book about this too. This is fairly new, and these papers have only been out for a couple of years, but they're doing very well. So I think we've made a real breakthrough here in understanding this. I want to talk a little bit, just end on my motivation for giving this talk and what I do. I got involved in this in studying the brain because, honestly, personally, I want to understand how it worked. When I was 20 years old, I said, I want to understand how I work, and that means I have to understand how the brain works, and I'm just going to spend my life doing that. I also believe very strongly that the long-term survival of humanity is going to require that we build truly intelligent machines. I didn't talk about that at all today, but I also believe that's the only way to do that is to first understand how the brain works and build machines that work on those principles. And then finally, I thought, so much of the strife and the difficulty we have in the world is based on people having different belief systems. And no one actually questions, most people have no idea how they form those beliefs and how they could be wrong. So I have a dream that in the future, every kid in high school will be taught in the same way they're taught about evolution, well, they should be taught about evolution, but the same way they're taught about genetics. That's very common today. We should all be learning about brains and how we form beliefs and how those beliefs can be incorrect and what is the structure of knowledge that's going on in our head. And if everybody understood that, starting at a young age, we would have a different discourse in the world. When we come to different beliefs about things, we would be able to sit down, oh, how did we get there? How can they be wrong? Understanding the science of it. So just understanding the science of belief itself will be a remedy to many of the problems in the world. And with that, I want to say thank you. I'm done.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell to be notified about new videos. You can follow us on social media, and if you really love what we do, consider supporting us with a donation. Links to all that good stuff is in the description below.